And I will start the backup recording, and you just give me the go-ahead when you're about ready to start, Paul.
Okay, let me just say one more thing before we start.
Sure.
It would be great if people wouldn't mind if you could unmute your video so we could kind of feel like we're in a room together. We are going to be recording the event. So if the FBI is after you right now, maybe it's best not to turn on your video. But please, if you don't mind, if you could unmute your video so we can see as many people as possible, that would be great. So Brian, why don't we start now?
Sure. Let me just get the live stream going and we can get started.
Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Paul Shannon. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Middle East Working Group of Massachusetts Peace Action. With us helping myself and our speaker tonight is Brian Garvey on the staff at Mass Peace Action, who'll be running the technology. What we'll be doing is after the presentation by Allison, we're going to be have some questions and answers, and we'll use the reactions button. So you can raise your hand and we'll be calling on you in the order that you raise your hands. At least that's the idea. So let us get right into this because we're very fortunate to have with us tonight Allison McManus to update us on just what is going on in the Middle East these days and what U.S. policy is about, given all the changes that have taken place since the Arab Spring, way back now, back in the old days. So Allison is welcome, Allison. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. Allison is speaking to us from Washington, D.C., right at the seat of power. Allison is the research director at the Freedom Initiative, actually the managing director, I believe now. Prior to that role, she served for 6 years as research director at the Tahrir Institute for the Middle East Policy. Allison has a decade of experience in international affairs and human rights, specializing on the Middle East and North Africa. Her work focuses on issues of security, democratization, and human rights. She has a master's degree in global and international studies from the University of California in Santa Barbara, and she is a graduate of Tufts University, right in our area. So I should say that the Freedom Initiative is an organization that fights for the release and rights of political prisoners in the Middle East. And I'm going to ask Allison, and welcoming her to talk about remember I don't know if people saw the announcement of tonight's event. You saw the picture of the Palestinian man. He is one of the people that Allison was working very hard and finally got released. So Allison, welcome, and let us begin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul, for the warm welcome. Really nice to see and meet everybody. Thanks, Brian, for running the show. And thanks, to all Massachusetts Peace Action Middle East Committee and other friends and supporters who are joining from all over the country, which is really cool. I don't know why I had the impression that this was going to be mostly folks from Massachusetts, but it seems like the name should be more all over the United States Peace Action. As you noted,
all over the world,
all over the world Peace Action. Yeah, as you noted, I did go to Tufts. I spent some time in Somerville and Medford. I actually grew up in Hampton, New Hampshire, so not too far away as well. So it means a lot to be able to speak to you all. As Paul mentioned, I have been working for the last decade or so in Washington, D.C. So, maybe not in the seat of power from here in my home office, but pretty close to it. And I would like to say, in my own small way, trying to speak some truth to that power. I joined the Tahrir Institute, which Paul mentioned, which was a small nonprofit that was founded after the 2011 uprisings by a group of Egyptians, Egyptian activists who were looking for an opportunity to actually have a space in Washington, D.C., where those who participated in the revolutions in the Middle East could influence policies that ultimately affected them. So I was there for 6 years, and then over the time that I was there, I saw that, you know, a lot of the activists, the revolutionaries, sort of the great minds of their generation, were being imprisoned and weren't actually able to speak truth to power, whether in DC, in Cairo, in you know, in their home countries. And so this is why I joined the Freedom Initiative as an opportunity to say, you know, those who should be able to speak freely, act freely, and carve out a new future for the Middle East and North Africa, one that would be independent, centered around human rights. You know, we couldn't do so because they were in jail. So as Paul mentioned, at the Freedom Initiative, we do work on cases of individual political prisoners. And so we'll work with their family members, with their lawyers, or, you know, other loved ones, folks who care about them, to try to develop strategies where they can advocate on their loved ones' behalf. That's usually to policymakers in the US or the West who have influence to be able to go to repressive regimes and you know, hopefully demand these releases. We'll also work to create public campaigns so that their stories become better known in, you know, either through the media, it could be social media. We do research, reports, documentation, accountability efforts. So we file cases at the UN, at the African Commission, even now in US courts. So we do kind of whole approach to how can we solve this problem of political imprisonment. You know, we want to see individuals released, but also how can we look at these individual releases as, you know, greater than, I guess, the sum of their parts in trying to seek some kind of more progressive change in the region. Paul mentioned the case of Rami Shaath. So Rami is an Egyptian Palestinian who was imprisoned in Egypt because he was leading the, you know, quite successful boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which was seen as a threat to the Egyptian power, because as Egypt was then normalizing with Israel, you know, he was protesting Egypt's role in the Manama conference, was jailed. And then after, you know, we campaigned for over 2 years, I was working alongside Rami's wife, Celine, and ultimately we saw him freed. And I know he came and spoke, so maybe some of you had a chance to also hear from him last year. I also want to mention a couple of other individual cases. So the case of Dr. Saif Fatin, and here I want to give a shout out to Asaf, who's also I work with on the US Committee to End Political Repression in Egypt. And Asaf is the one who connected me with Paul and with Massachusetts Peace Action. I'm mentioning Asaf because Dr. Saif Fatin was is an MIT alum. Asaf is a professor at MIT. And so we've been working together to try to raise more awareness about Dr. Saif's case. He was a professor of engineering in Egypt. He served in the Morsi government, so the government that was overthrown in a military coup in 2013. And you know, simply for that reason, he's been imprisoned for nearly 4 years now. He was enforcedly disappeared. He was brutally tortured, has never faced any formal charges, has never been put on trial. And so we're really trying to raise awareness about his case, you know, as one that I think is sort of emblematic of the brutality and the arbitrary nature of repression right now in Egypt. I also work on a number of cases in Saudi Arabia, one of which is the case of Abdurrahman Sadhan. Abdurrahman Sadhan is a Saudi citizen. Most of his family is based in like the San Francisco region in the United States. Many of them are also US citizens. He had an online persona that was kind of a satirical persona that was poking fun at the Saudi religious establishment, was poking fun at the leaders of the Saudi kingdom. The Saudi government actually had planted spies in Twitter. So had Saudi agents who were working at Twitter who got his actual information, passed it back to the Saudi regime, and not just him, but a number of folks who were running these anonymous accounts. When he went back to Saudi and was doing work for the Red Crescent, he was arrested. He was also forcibly disappeared, brutally tortured. And his sister from their family home in Northern California has been leading a campaign to advocate for his release as well. So we've been working with her not only to discuss Abdurrahman's the campaign and his case, but also looking for ways to seek accountability, again, because she is a US citizen. Are there ways that we could mobilize her representatives, her senators, or US courts to try to pursue some justice for her family? All that was not even necessarily what I wanted to talk about today. I know that, we're here to kind of take a step back and look big picture, but I do like to use any opportunity to raise some of the names, because I think it's important to remember, like, these are human faces that we're talking about when we talk about counter-revolution, when we talk about authoritarianism and talk about repression. These are not just theoretical political concepts. These do have very, very human costs. But to take a step back and kind of trace, I know we want to see, like, how did we get here? So I do want to maybe roll back the clock now. 13 years, which does sort of feel like, I guess we're 12 years, 12, 13 years, to where were we at the time of the Arab Spring and the uprisings that happened in 2011, because I do think that it's important that we kind of have a sense of where everything started, because these were quite hopeful times. Since then, I'm going to kind of hopefully trace a trajectory and also insert the role of the United States in this trajectory. I'm going to have sort of three main points to get us there. One is that there has been a devastating counter-revolution, resurgence of authoritarianism and conflict after the 2011 uprisings in the Arab Spring. Two, unlike previous eras, these dynamics are not primarily animated by the United States, but the United States has played a role, and not just the United States, but I would say the West. Three, the result is that we've seen a Middle East and North Africa that's become a ground of contestation for major powers. So we've seen the US still trying to grapple with what its influence is in the region, particularly as now the US sees itself in a battle with Russia and China. We also see the Gulf and Israel seeking to assert power in different ways in the region. Ultimately, I would posit that these new dynamics have resulted both in more entrenched authoritarianism and conflict, but they also create instabilities that might provide openings for change in the future. And the question that we'll face is, what will those changes look like? Will we see another era of kind of hope and openness like we did in 2011, or will we see more exploitative and violative practices, social divisions, et cetera? Spoiler alert, I don't know the answer, but I'm hoping that if we can trace some of these paths, maybe together we can have a productive discussion, or at least an interesting debate about what the future might look like. So again, going back to 2010, December 2010, Mohamed Bouazizi self-immolates in Tunisia. This is sort of the, we could say the spark that begins a wave of protests. January 2011, uprisings in Egypt, beginning January 25th, 18 days later, we see regime change and Mubarak falls. By the end of January, Yemenis are protesting in Senate. And I think it's important to remember even these protracted conflicts began with peaceful uprisings. February 2011, Bahrain has the Pearl uprisings. In Libya, there's demonstrations against Gaddafi. In Morocco, even there were demonstrations. The Mouvement 20 Février takes to the streets. By March 2011, Syria, which was one of the most brutal dictatorships, is also erupts into peaceful protest. So here we have very similar sort of response, very similar, calls for peaceful calls for bread, freedom, social justice. But then pretty soon thereafter, we see the beginning of counter-revolution. So authoritarian leaders respond with force almost across the board. And then, of course, Libya, Syria become conflicts. Egypt and Tunisia see regime change, but different types of regime change. In Morocco, Morocco, I would say, is the only context in which we saw like an immediate reassertion of power through kind of co-optation of these movements. The king responds with constitutional reform, and so kind of nips some of this momentum in the bud. I would argue that over the 10 years after, the reason why we see an almost complete reversal of those hopeful days are for three reasons. One, I think across the board, except maybe in Tunisia, the deep state in these countries was never truly dismantled. So the security apparatus or apparati that were built up over decades remained. So even where there was regime change in Egypt, we see Mubarak out. Even in the transitional governments that followed, there was never really a tackling of what's the military's role. They said nominally that they were going to disband the national, or at the time it was the Aman al-Watani, and then it became national. So there's a renaming in some cases of the same security agencies without a real dismantling. Similarly, in Morocco, again, there's no real change. In Tunisia, I think there was a real effort to try to sort of rethink what the state looked like and what the state's relationship with the people would be. But that's also in a state where there was, the deep state was not quite as entrenched as it was elsewhere. So brutal repression of dissent and free speech, torture and enforced disappearance, and arbitrary detention remain modus operandi across the board, whether this is conflict states or authoritarian states. The second point that I would make is that I think, and this one I always like to be careful because I don't want this to look like sort of victim blaming, but these nascent political and civil movements and even some of the opposition groups were so used to operating in this beleaguered context that given the opportunity to self-govern, there wasn't a lot of historical experience with that. So for instance, what we see in Egypt when the Freedom and Justice Party comes to power and the Muslim Brotherhood has the opportunity to govern, they pretty quickly end up resorting to a Mubarak playbook, whether that is in terms of how they want to run the political economy and looking at austerity measures and need for international support from international financial institutions, or whether it comes to rewriting the constitution to try to centralize power in the presidency. The third dynamic I would say is that their external crises gave authoritarian leaders the pretext to crack down. And so this kind of leads to a feedback loop. So this is the way that authoritarian leaders would securitize basically securitizing the revolutionary momentum. So here is where they're like using the global war on terror vernacular. So using the global war on terror laws so that anything that looks like a challenge to their power, whether that's an actual insurgent threat, a jihadist threat, or simply peaceful protest, all becomes terrorism. And of course, this is at a time in 2015 when this is also, and we'll get into this in a bit, you know, what the West, what the United States is primarily concerned with, fighting ISIS, and again, sort of using that global war on terror playbook to then support authoritarian leaders in their so-called fight against terrorism. Another external dynamic is the economic crises that after the 2011 revolutions and after we saw, whether it was conflict or several transitional governments in some states, many of the countries in the region, leaving the Gulf out of the picture, were in economic crisis, which forced then either, again, adoption of austerity measures, which if that led to any kind of frustration and political protests were then cracked down on, gave the state a reason to say, okay, we need a strong authoritarian state. If there's, you know, if there's continued uprisings, then we're just going to continue to have this economic crisis. And then also some of the regional instability was used as a, well, this could be worse. So for Egypt, for example, well, it could be worse. If you don't have Sisi, it could be Syria, it could be Libya. You know, in Morocco, we would see this as well. I would argue that unlike in previous eras, these dynamics were not fully animated by the US, but the US failed to articulate any kind of coherent policy or response. And was more concerned about waning influence or combating terrorism to actually provide real meaningful support to the revolutionary movements. So this is more to say that this past decade, rather than being characterized by devastating military intervention, as in the Gulf Wars or the invasion of Iraq, we saw more of a like lead from behind approach under Obama. This was how he articulated his Middle East policy. With Trump, it was, I would say, a bromance approach of just complete and outright authoritarian affinity. You know, even posing with Mohammed bin Salman, posing with President Sisi. And now it's everything becomes seen through the lens of a great powers competition. So again, I think that's something that maybe, you know, I know we're almost at the half-hour mark. I'm going to leave some of that there because I think this might form some interesting discussion based on what I understand of our previous discussions from the committee here. So I'm going to speak a bit about where we are now, which is, again, I would say the primary concern that's animating the Biden administration's foreign policy is this counterbalancing of Russia and China. And looking at MENA as a zone of contestation. So throughout Trump and Obama years, China has sought to develop economic ties in the region through its Belt and Road Initiative. And now we've seen that play out in how China was able to broker discussions between Iran and Saudi Arabia to cease hostilities in Yemen. I think this is viewed as a positive development to, I mean, you know, we can talk a little bit about how some folks see the way that things are going with the Houthis in Yemen, but certainly the end to hostilities is something that we would love to see there. However, I would say from the perspective of the Biden administration, the fact that this was China taking the lead at doing the brokering is seen as a concern. Russia has had a complicated role in the region. Russia's supported Assad and Khalifa Haftar in Libya while seeking to expand its footprint, which is a bit complicated because it's opposing Gulf interests in Syria, but supporting them in Libya. Israel, obviously, as we've seen through the Abraham Accords, is no longer viewed as the adversary that it once was. We've seen serious warming of relations with Egypt, Morocco, and even Saudi Arabia. And I think that has been largely, of course, spurred on by the United States in seeking this kind of, you know, if not what Kushner's idea of the deal of the century was seeing the Abraham Accords as the way forward for Middle East peace. And then, of course, we have the Gulf exerting its power through large cash transfers, investments to country like Egypt, and wielding political and economic influence through OPEC, and of course, militarily through the war in Yemen. We didn't get much into the Gulf dynamics, but I think it's worth mentioning the way that the blockade of Qatar influenced regional politics and human rights by reinforcing divisions between some of the authoritarian leaders, whether those aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood or MBS. So that's something we could tease out also in discussion if we wanted to get a little bit more into like what Saudi and the UAE's sort of politics have been over the past decade. So and then also, so to wrap this part up, I would say then what we see is, if we're talking about, because I know it's of interest to this group to think about, the US's role in terms of the foreign military financing that it provides to countries like Egypt and Israel, for instance. When we talk about, I'll speak more about the dynamics of US aid to Egypt, because that's what I've worked on much more closely. The US cut off aid in 2013 very briefly after one of the most brutal, if not the most brutal, massacres at Rabaa al-Adawiya Square, in which hundreds of peaceful protesters were killed outright in broad daylight by el-Sisi. The aid was cut off very briefly, and it was then reinstated despite the fact that there was no accountability for any of the deaths that occurred there. In fact, most of the military leaders that were involved in orchestrating and carrying out that massacre remain in power or were promoted, frankly, despite the fact that Sisi has only increased the campaign of repression against Egyptians. More and more Egyptians, innocent Egyptians like Dr. Seyfettin in prison. I think estimates now are around 65,000, but there's really no way to tell, because absent a system of rule of law, how do you know if somebody's being targeted because they have spoken out politically, because they've angered a military officer, or if they've committed a crime? If there's no way to guarantee fair trials and due process, I would say that anybody's a political prisoner. And yet we've seen security assistance continue to Egypt at $1.3 billion. Part of this, I think, is certainly there's, the desire to maintain the qualitative edge with Israel. So as long as Israel is receiving a certain amount of security assistance, Egypt will as well. But increasingly we hear from policymakers, well, if we don't provide this military aid to Egypt, if we don't maintain the relationship with Sisi as the status quo, then Egypt will get closer to China, Egypt will get closer to Russia, and will essentially lose our ability to influence. And so I think that it is this, again, this fear of amongst the US administration and policymakers of losing influence that is now used as sort of the lens for support for Sisi and the maintenance of military aid. We have seen amongst Congress more, I would say, willingness to try to at least condition some of the aid on release of prisoners, for instance. And so we've seen now more of that $1.3 billion aid package has been carved out, in which could only be released if there's certain human rights conditions. I can get really into the weeds on this, but there's, a certain amount that's carved out based on the human rights conditions, which could be waived if the Secretary of State sees that it's in the US national security interest. So of course, what happens every year, they say we can't certify these human rights conditions, but it's still in the national security interest. So we're still going to give them the $1.3 billion package anyway. So now Congress has started to carve out more, which is not able to be waived in a national security interest. And yet we've still seen that the administration has sort of found ways around that. Ironically, I would say under Rex Tillerson, they actually withheld aid and said this was based on, certain reforms that needed to be seen around preserving more freedoms for civil society. Tillerson thought that these reforms were made. I don't know that I mean, I wouldn't agree. Release the aid anyway. Last year, Blinken did withhold some of the aid, asking for 16 political prisoners. Again, that's 16 out of 65,000 plus. Those 16, of course, were not released. And this was, withholding 130 million versus the 1.3 billion. So we're seeing these very, 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 when I say like modest, small progress from Congress, I mean, really, we're talking about like a very, very, very small percentage of that aid relationship. So again, I wanted to just speak to that a bit because I know that this is something that Paul mentioned is of interest to the committee. So I would say here we are, it's 2023. The result of the past, decade plus is that we have a region that looks somewhat similar to pre-2011, and that there's, very serious repression, very little free speech. I would say economic crises that are worse than they were in 2010, and getting worse even. The difference, I would say, is that it's, there's less stability in the region because we do have these sort of great powers competition. Not to say that this is so different from what things have been in the past, but I would say that it's a more destabilizing picture. What I would also say is there's a difference from 2010 in that there has been a lot of learning amongst the civil society in the region, a lot of learning amongst the political activists. There's been continued organizing, whether that's been in exile or in diaspora, or efforts to sort of preserve the hope of 2011, even under very, very difficult circumstances. So again, I see this all the time in the work that we're doing, even where there's so many who are in prison, there are campaigns for release, there's efforts to sort of think about what an alternative vision for the Middle East could look like that would not be either under dictatorship in conflict or something that looked like a sort of Western supported regime change, but what could real indigenous change look like in the region? And what would sort of like the longevity of democratic movements look like if they were truly coming from the people who rose up in 2011. I'll leave it there to see what questions we might have. Again, we're like covered a lot here. So yeah, let's see where you all want to take things from here, and I will do my best. I'm not an expert in everything, but if I don't know the answer to something, I'll let you know and see if I can direct you to folks who do.
Okay, well, thank you, Allison, for that sweeping analysis. Let's open the floor for questions. If people could go under your reactions button at the bottom of your screen and just click on raise hand. We will call you. We will unmute you so you can ask your question yourself. Anyone want to start? I would actually like to, why don't we start with Vincent? Go ahead, Vincent.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I had written to Dianne Feinstein, my senator, when she finally got back to Washington regarding the expulsions from Masaraf Yap. And she wrote back to me that it was imperative that we work towards the two-state solution. Like the great Edward Said said before he died, that seems to be all but completely bankrupt. Do you believe that the two-state solution is, as Edward and I believe, a dead issue? Or do you believe there is something that could bring it back to life? And if not, what would a one-state solution, if ever possible, look like in the state of Israel?
Yeah, thanks. It's a big question. So first, I want to clarify, I have not worked much on the Israel-Palestine issue. So what I'm saying more just from my personal feelings more than I am as say an expert on this. And also, I guess what I've seen in DC and in working on in other contexts in the region, I don't see that there is much hope for a two-state solution. I think that we will continue to see policymakers talk about a two-state solution while not really doing much to try to advance, what that could possibly look like in any way that was equitable, I would say, or, I would say anything probably that me or the folks who are here would envision as a reasonable outcome. I think the concern then is, and I think actually what we've seen in terms of trends in the region is a one-state solution that looks very similar to what Israel looks like today, with continued occupation, expansion of settlements. And unfortunately, I think that this is the way, even just today, Secretary Blinken was talking about the King of Morocco and how he's been a great friend to the Israelis and the Palestinians. The King of Morocco is somebody who recognized, when Trump said he was moving the embassy to Jerusalem, who was one of the first to recognize this, because he also said that this would mean we wouldn't recognize the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara. I think the fact that we see now between Saudi Arabia and Egypt coming to terms over the Strait of Tiran and the islands in Tiran and Sanafir, which is also the cession of these islands. I don't know if folks were familiar or remember, there were big protests in Egypt when Sisi said he was going to give the islands of Tiran and Sanafir to Saudi Arabia. This had to be done with the endorsement of Israel. And I think this speaks to the way that Egypt, Israel, and Saudi Arabia are now, working together. So I don't think that a two-state solution is viable. I don't think that it's probably ever been viable. I think that the reality is a one-state solution in the region means this sort of rapprochement with Israel and greater tolerance for the Israeli occupation. So it's not a very, unfortunately, not a very hopeful response to your question, but that again, that's my kind of personal read from the conversations that I've had here.
Okay, thanks, Allison. Thanks, Vincent. Debbie Blaine, do you want to go next?
Yeah, and I'm going to stay off camera, sorry.
Sure.
I want to address the two-state solution thing as well. I don't see any way that there can be a two-state solution because of, number one, Gaza and the West Bank being separated by so much land, but also the fact that the settlements have just eaten up so much Palestinian land that they're basically in reservations, like what we've done to the Native Americans in this country, which is, in fact, there's a lot of similarities with that, because they've been forced to give up their land, their cultures, in a lot of ways, everything that they used to know. And that's how it is in Palestine with the Palestinians. But I can't conceive that there would be a way without a contiguous piece of land to have a state. So that's my input. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie.
Thank you, Debbie.
I do want to just note, because I think it's quite interesting. We saw, obviously there were recently major demonstrations in Israel in response to some of Netanyahu's attempts at kind of, well, we can't really call them reform, but power consolidation. And I do note that, there was negative response from US policymakers, et cetera. However, that was more of a sense of, okay, now Netanyahu's, he's gone too far in, overstepping the bounds of what Israelis would tolerate. However, the status quo of continued occupation, of continued support for expanding settlements, that's not necessarily an issue. So again, I do think that it speaks to, the fact that there is tolerance, I would say tolerance, if not outright support from the folks in DC for these, policies of violence and disenfranchisement and land expropriation, as long as it's done, in a way that doesn't kind of destabilize Israel.
Right. Okay, thank you, Allison. Farrell Brody, are you trying to ask a question? Can you find him, Brian?
Just one second. Yeah. Go ahead, Farrell, if you have a question.
Yeah, I don't know. My question is, why is anybody still asking that question about the two-state solution? It's a ridiculous question. I was just finished reading the New Left review of this March, April 2006. How many years ago was that? 17 years ago or something? And they completely understood that there was no hope for a two-state solution. The name two-state solution is a US sham. It has no chance in the world of ever coming to fruition, because the Zionist program is to take over the whole land, for God's sake. They want to take it over, the whole land. They don't want any of the Palestinians in there if they can help it. And
Farrell?
the Palestinians now and in the future. That's my comment and question.
Okay.
Sorry.
Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Allison, or has it all been said?
No. I mean, I see that there are some other hands up, so nothing more to add there.
Okay, Mark Ginsburg.
Yes, Allison, thank you very much for your analysis and report. I want to refocus on Egypt for at least a few minutes, and it sounds like that's an area you spend a lot of time with. I was involved with a U.S. government-funded education reform program in Egypt and lived in Cairo for the period 2004 to 2000, almost 2007, and then continued to work on it for a few years after that, not up until the Arab Spring period, though. Although I was in Tahrir Square in December of 2011, visiting with some friends and colleagues. What struck me during the Mubarak period, and it was a U.S. government-funded education reform program, so we were dealing with the Egyptian government. But more to the point is what struck me is a number of my relatively progressive Egyptian colleagues seemed to tolerate Mubarak's less than democratic environment because of concerns of security. And again, I can't say to have spoken to a representative sample, but what surprised me, though, was after the Arab Spring and after Morsi was elected, many of them became part of the opposition and actually in the streets, which was not something they generally had done previous to that. And today, as I talk to them, they seem, in my view, too comfortable with the current regime in Egypt. And when I ask them about that, they say, well, we want to get on with our life and have, security, or at least peace. I mean, none of them have been arrested, and none of their relatives are imprisoned. But they certainly remember a time when it was felt unsafe to go out on the street. I mean, have you talked with people in Egypt and received a similar response? And how much of this is the result of their reality, or about the mediated perception of that reality that comes from the LCC government?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. It's a great question. And I think, this is something that I mentioned, the securitization of the public sphere, let's say, and the equation of dissent. We could say free speech, we could say critique of the regime or its policies, with terrorism. And the fact that people are often willing to give up rights and freedoms because they see that this is somehow, that's sort of a zero sum with security, because this is what authoritarian leaders would tell them. And also not just authoritarian leaders, like we saw this in the United States post 9/11 with the passage of the Patriot Act. I mean, it's a part of a playbook to say, okay, there's a destabilizing event or a security threat, and then that becomes exploited as a reason to curtail all manner of rights and freedoms. So I don't doubt that that's something that, when told, would you rather be safe and secure or be able to go and, post something nasty about CC on Twitter, people would say, oh, I would rather be safe and secure. The problem is it's a false dichotomy, because the fact that CC can have 65,000, people like Saif Fatin doesn't actually, putting a professor of environmental engineering behind bars, like, that's not making anybody any safer. But if you say this guy's a terrorist, then people think, well, I'm not going to speak up for him because I'm living my life just fine. And similarly, I think that the Sisi regime particularly has mobilized this rhetoric of, look what's happening in Syria. If you didn't have me, that's what Egypt could look like. And he says that not only to the people of Egypt, but also to the United States and other Western leaders. If you don't continue to provide me with the military aid so I can control, the population, if we had another uprising, this could end up being, 6 million people who are now traveling to Europe, but a country of 100 million if Egypt destabilizes. The problem with that is now we see Egypt. When did you say, Mark, that you were there up until 2010 or 2006? I think you might be muted. Well, let's say up until 2015, 2016, the Egyptian pound was, oh yeah, there you go.
I lived there until 2006, but I continued to travel and work there on this project until 2009. But I continued to travel because I had colleagues and friends.
So the Egyptian pound, I think, even under Mubarak, like, I think by 2015, the pound was still pegged to like 8 pounds to the dollar. In 2016, they let the pound freely float and it went to 16 pounds to the dollar overnight. So people lost, say, half their savings. It's at now 30 pounds, more than 30 pounds to the dollar. So people have lost, and part of this has to do with the fact that there is a, centralized state under CC. People can't advocate for, any vision that doesn't look like state-led austerity measures that are backed by the IMF. or having the Gulf come in and pour money into, Sisi's pockets, which then goes to, networks where the military benefits from this uneven playing field. So I think ultimately, I'm mentioning this because, people who might think that they're choosing or see that Sisi is a better alternative also still end up with rising inequality, unbearable poverty. I mean, for a country of 100 million people, the poverty line has remained the same. We're talking about tens of millions of people who are living below $2 a day. So yeah, ultimately this trade-off of can we give up some rights and freedoms for having a bit of security for living a day-to-day normal life hasn't panned out. So yeah, again, like I don't doubt that that's the sentiment that folks have, and I don't wouldn't pass judgment on them for feeling that way. But unfortunately, the reality is that you can't have one without the other. You can't have kind of economic stability. You can't have political stability without having some element of openness to alternatives, some openness to challenging the positions of the ruler.
Thank you.
Oh, Paul, you're muted.
Thanks, Brian. I'd like to ask you, this whole relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States seems to be changing rapidly, with Saudi Arabia just kicking Biden in the teeth over and over again. And yet, does Saudi Arabia just feel pretty secure in its relationship with the United States, that the U.S. will continue with all its hundreds and hundreds of advisors there, with all its military sales, with covering for it diplomatically and all that? Or is something going on there between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia? How does the U.S. feel, for instance, about Saudi's talks with Iran, and how that seems to undermine the U.S.-Israeli attempt to destroy Iran? So any comments or thoughts you have about what's going on with the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and how the meetings between Saudi Arabia and Iran are impacting that, or whether the U.S. feels fine about that or is really very upset? What is your take on what's going on there?
Yeah, Paul, I mean, I think it's a complicated picture, because I think in many ways we saw this play out. The US is still very beholden to Saudi oil interests, and MBS used that, I think made that pretty clear when, he refused to kind of play ball with OPEC, and when Biden, I think, went to Saudi Arabia thinking that MBS was going to play kind of the way that Saudi Arabia has played things before, which is supporting, US interests no matter what those are. And I think MBS has shown in many ways that he is not as interested in doing that, and that he'll use the US alliance when it's useful and not when it's not. And I think that and I think the Biden administration has compromised quite a lot and kind of conceded quite a lot for very, let's say, for very little in return. I mean, let's not forget that Jamal Khashoggi, the brutal murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, who is a Virginia resident who lived just down the road here, was a Washington Post columnist. Biden swore that he was going to make MBS, yes, Mohammed bin Salman, swore that he was going to make MBS a pariah, and then, went to Jeddah and didn't shake his hand, but did fist bump him. And again, didn't necessarily get the kind of, I would say, didn't get in return what he, I think, maybe had hoped for in terms of Saudi's attention to US interests. With regard to the kind of warming of ties between Saudi and Iran, I would say it's probably, first of all, like too soon to really know what this means, whether this is actually like a meaningful path towards any kind of reconciliation. I think that from the perspective of the US, I mean, should be from the perspective of the US a good thing to stop the hostilities in Yemen. But you know, as I said earlier, I think that it's quite frustrating that one, China was ahead of this and the one to broker it. And two, I think because it's sort of unknown what this will mean for Iran's position in the region. So I don't have a good read on what that's going to look like moving forward. I think it's certainly something to keep an eye on, because it would be a massive shift in regional power dynamics, of course.
Okay, Brian, thanks. Well, just following up on that, I would assume that Israel is upset about that rapprochement if it's going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran, given how Israel is so focused on undermining the nuclear treaty with Iran and so determined to destroy any Iranian nuclear capability. Do you have a read on that in terms of Israel's attitude toward the rapprochement?
Yeah, I mean, Israel sees Iran as the #1 threat to its existence. And certainly, as you said, is not happy with the JCPOA and the way that was constructed, and certainly would not see like a Saudi-Iran rapprochement as being in its interests. And I think this is why I think it's still a little bit too soon to really know with Iran and Saudi Arabia how far this is going to go. So again, one of the things that I don't have my crystal ball to know exactly where this is headed, but again, I think for now, something to celebrate, at least, that we're seeing a hopeful end to the really particularly brutal war in Yemen.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to keep on asking questions. I'm kind of fascinated by Egypt myself. Egypt kind of goes under the radar in terms of attention of all the countries in the Middle East. There's plenty of attention on Iran, certainly, on Syria, on Saudi Arabia. But Egypt, there's very little thinking about it, very little critique about it. I've always wondered what in the world happened after, to zero in on that period after the Arab Spring uprising and the elections that brought Morsi to power. What happened then? That seemed to have the opportunity of kind of stabilizing the country, and while not creating the greatest place on earth, of really making Egypt a much more, wonderful country in terms of its political structure. And yet it just all went to hell. And of course, this story we got here in the United States, that was Morsi just became incredibly totalitarian, started repressing everybody. And so everyone started to turn against him, and the military took the side of the people to get rid of Morsi and bring about this new dictatorship, or whatever we want to call it. What is your reading of those events and transitions, and what really happened there?
I think it was a very fragile time after, if we're talking 2012, 2013, these are the first democratic elections, parliamentary elections, and then presidential elections that the country had experienced ever. And again, as I mentioned, I think there wasn't a lot of, when it comes to, okay, now we need to organize political parties in 2 years, and we need to rethink what could a democratic state, again, a state of 100 million people, what does that look like? There wasn't a lot of, we didn't see these kind of political isolation laws like we saw in Libya, for instance, where it was like, get out everybody that was from the previous regime. So there was some institutional learning, but when it came to who's making the policy, there was hardly any. We know that while the elections were free and fair, they were still heavily contested. I mean, these were elections in which there were like street battles in certain areas. And ultimately the Brotherhood did come to power, but it wasn't as though it were, were very narrow margins to begin with. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that the Brotherhood was never fully trusted. I would say this is an organization that had to operate underground for so many years and had to operate as this sort of clandestine opposition group. And so while it was very well organized, particularly as a service provider of goods, a provider of charity in many areas, in other areas, it was heavily just mistrusted. So now we have, again, like a government that comes to power narrowly with a great sense of mistrust and with a population that's used to coming out into the streets, as opposed to, coming out into the streets to bring change about, as opposed to perhaps now actually being able to organize and seek that change through formal politics. Morsi did, of course, like I said, there were efforts to consolidate power when Morsi felt threatened. And these did bring about genuine responses from the streets. We also know now that, again, the SCAF, who were the military leaders, who were, after all, the ones who deposed Mubarak, remained in power throughout the whole time. And they also never really trusted Morsi. So we know now that while there was this sort of popular response to, again, starting from mistrust to then a response to the way that Morsi wanted to consolidate power, this was also very much sponsored and encouraged by the SCAF. So this whole idea that there were then like the marches, in 2013, yes, there were massive marches in 2013. Were they bigger than 2011? Like, this is something that people, will constantly raise scrutiny and concerns about. And I also think that Egyptians, I have friends who protested in 2013, protested for Morsi's removal in 2013, who have serious guilt about having done that, and who thought that 2013 would be similar to 2011. Okay, we'll see that somebody who's, looking more dictatorial will be removed, and then we'll move again to new parliamentary elections or presidential elections. But of course, at that point, SCAF said, and now this is when we see Sisi's rise, like, yeah, sure, we'll do parliamentary elections later. Clearly that was like a failed attempt. Let's just give things some time. And then immediately names the Muslim Brotherhood, pretty immediately by the end of the year, by August had brutally cleared out the square at Rabah. And by the end of the year, names the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization and begins to arrest all of the leaders. So I think that there were these, again, over the period of just a few years, kind of sequence of developments that was less about Morsi being, another, like, looking back. I think obviously this would have been a better political experiment than what ended up happening. Probably, could have led to more democracy, but that kind of the deep state, the SCAF, the military never really relinquished power. The people never really fully trusted that the Muslim Brotherhood could deliver, the democratic change that they wanted to see. And so we just ended up with this, like I said, counter-revolutionary forces coming in, within a period of 6-7 months, sort of dismantling any of the gains that had been won over the past 2 years.
Well, thanks, Allison, for going through that for me. I appreciate it. It's just seems like such a tragedy, given the high hopes at the time, not just in Egypt, of course, but Egypt seemed to be the center of the world's attention for that particular period of time in 2011. And so many hopes were raised. And it'd be good to know what the lessons are, as I'm sure the Egyptians are going through that right now, trying to figure all that out. Well, thank you very much. It's actually quite late. Thank you so much for that overview, Allison. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be able to have you back sometime to kind of follow up on ongoing developments, especially as this China's influence seems to be growing in the area, and the Cold War between the US and China is obviously reaching a fever pitch, to say nothing of the war with Russia. And so it seems to me there's a lot of fluidity there. And it'll be very interesting, for instance, to see what actually works out in Yemen. And to me, the question is, I think Saudi Arabia wants to get out of Yemen, but I don't think the US wants it to. We'll have to stay on touch of all that. Meanwhile, good luck with all your work, working on behalf of the political prisoners. I'll mention to people on the call that we will be sending a recording of this webinar that Brian has recorded for us. Within a couple of days, you'll be getting an email with that, plus some links to other materials that Allison is going to provide us with. So thank you, everyone, and hope you all have a good evening, and let's stay on top of this situation.
Thanks so
Thanks
much,
again,
everybody.
Allison.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Allison.
Have a great night.
Bye now.
Bye.